It was a perfect spring morning, late in its days when Emily and I first arrived at our new home. The air was crispy with the aura of blooming flowers, and the sky was an unmarred expanse of blue. We had spent months scouring for the right place, and when we laid eyes on this cozy little house in the suburbs, it seemed like a dream come true. Everything was idyllic about the neighborhood. Children played in the streets. Neighbors met with warm smiles, and there was an unmistakable air of peace and security. As we unpacked our boxes and began the settlement in, our neighbors came over to introduce themselves. There was Mr. Henderson, the old man next door, who was always pruning his rose bushes. Living opposite were the Myers, a very jolly couple with twin girls who peeped out from behind their mother-s legs to shyly wave at us. And lastly, the Parkers, who on that very first weekend had us over for a barbecue. Things were so amiable I couldn't believe my luck. The first days went by in a whirl of unpacking and starting to make out our way around the new place. Emily, especially, fawned over the ample backyard that our new abode graced us with, fit for the garden of her dreams. My own time was spent getting our new home office all set up, and some of the renovation projects we had lined up planned out. In the evenings, we would sit on our porch, sipping wine and soaking in the serene atmosphere. It didn't take long for the first weird thing to happen. It was Wednesday evening, and we were both knocked out after having worked all day unpacking. Laying in bed, I heard a strange noise outside, really faint, like some kind of far-off chant being carried on the wind. I sat up and strained to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. Beside me, Emily stirred. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice groggy. "Nothing. I just thought that I heard something," I replied, while trying to push off the unease that settled in my chest. The next morning, I told Mr. Henderson when we were chatting across the fence. He looked at me searchingly and then smiled. "You'll hear all sorts of noises around here. It's just the wind playing tricks on you," he said. But there was something in his eyes that belied the reassurance in his tone. I tried to put the previous night behind me, but the next night the chanting returned. This time it was louder, clearer, and it was chilling. I sat up from the bed and walked to the window, peering into the darkness. The street was empty, only the streetlights emanated a glow. Yet the sound continued, a rhythmic chant that seemed to be resounding out of the depths of the neighborhood. Emily awakened again, this time more cognitively aware. "Do you hear that?" I murmured. She nodded, her eyes wide with worry. "It's so eerie." The chanting came to an abrupt stop, leaving a foreboding silence in the room. Both of us sat there for what seemed like forever, neither saying anything. It wasn't until the very next day that I considered any form of investigation. Thus, I embarked on a walk around the neighborhood, clearly keeping an eye on anything out of order. Everything was just perfect. All the kids were playing around, neighbors gardening, and usual suburban activity. Yet, there was something unsettling going on underneath it all. Something I just couldn't put my finger on. At the barbecue that weekend, I had mentioned, in passing, to our hosts, the Parkers, that I was hearing weird noises. Mark Parker shook his head, laughing. "You're probably just hearing the wind," he said, repeating Mr. Henderson. "This place can play tricks on you if you're not used to it." But looking around at the other neighbors, I noticed a few uneasy looks exchanged. Emily and I shared a glance, saying something was not quite right with this. As the weeks passed, we chanted every night. We lost sleep, some deep feeling of foreboding eating away inside us. We tried to record the sound, but each time we played it back, it was nothing more than white noise. The friction between the both of us was growing as well, with the both of us clearly feeling the strain of both sleepless nights and the quiet, unspoken fear that something had gone very wrong indeed. And so, one fateful night, we decided to track down the sound. It was perilous, but desperation drove us. We sneaked out from the house, ensuring there were no eyes on us. The chanting lured us through the neighborhood into the denser section, the rhythm now loud and eerie. We heeded its call to a small wooded area on the suburb fringe, someplace we had never ventured. In the midst, there was an opening within the trees, and at its center stood a gathering of robed and hooded figures whose faces defied the seeing. They stood in a circle, chanting words not understood by our ears. In the circle-S center, there was a stone altar with strange marks. Emily latched onto my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. We were riveted to the spot, unable to rip our eyes from the gruesome scene playing out before us. By the time the chant had reached its freak-out apex, one of the figures raised a knife, and horror dawning, we realized there was someone tied to the altar. And we ran back to our house, hearts pounding fast, with that image of the ritual burned in our minds. We locked all doors and windows, petrified that those cult members saw us. That night, we didn't sleep at all, huddled together in the living room, waiting for anything to happen. The next day, we decided to go to the police. We had to tell somebody about that. But coming to the station, we faced skepticism. The officer was rather polite, of course, yet showed some signs of sarcasm and a clear wish to mean that we were just another pair of overactive imaginations stirred up by too many horror movies. This made us go home even more frustrated and scared, but more than ever, determined to get to the bottom of this. We also began keeping a very detailed journal of the noises and other strange occurrences, starting on research on the history of the neighborhood where they live, attempting to find any clues we can piece together to explain these events. What we found was chilling. The entire suburb had been built over an ancient settlement, one with a very dark past. There were rumors of some cult that practiced human sacrifice, a group that seemed to disappear into thin air at the time the settlement was abandoned. The more we investigated, the more it looked as if the cult had somehow managed to survive and had blended in with the friendly faces of our neighbors. As we pieced together the puzzle, we got a growing sense of dread. Realization dawned on us this was far deeper than ever imagined, and exposing the truth would be far more perilous than ever thought of. But we couldn't go back now, not with our lives on the line. The final straw came when we received an anonymous note in our mailbox. It was a single piece of paper with the message scrawled in some spidery hand: "Stop asking questions, or you will be next." Then we knew we were running out of time. Unless we acted soon, we would just be another set of victims of the horrifying rituals the cult performed. Our once quiet neighborhood had been turned into our worst nightmare, and we were in the middle of it. With no one to trust and nowhere to turn, Emily and I prepared for the fight of our lives. The reality of Horror Faced had not yet set in, for we knew not exactly how deep the darkness really was. But one thing we did know: we will not go down without a fight. The note was a stark reminder of the danger we faced, but it also solidified our resolve. We couldn't run, not yet. We had to uncover the truth and put an end to the cult's horrifying rituals. Emily and I decided to divide our efforts. She would continue researching, while I would gather evidence and try to find allies among the neighbors. Our first step was to install hidden cameras around the house, especially near windows and doors. We hoped to catch some footage of the chanting or any other suspicious activity. As we reviewed the recordings each morning, the tension in our home grew. We saw shadows moving outside our windows, figures lurking in the darkness, but nothing concrete that we could take to the authorities. One night, as we were reviewing the footage, we saw something that made our blood run cold. A hooded figure appeared on the screen, standing just outside our bedroom window. The figure stood there, motionless, staring into the camera for what felt like an eternity before disappearing into the night. We realized with horror that they knew we were watching them, and they were watching us right back. Emily suggested we try to find allies among the neighbors. We needed to know if anyone else was aware of the cult or had experienced anything similar. We started with the Myers. Over coffee one afternoon, we carefully broached the subject, mentioning the strange noises and our sleepless nights. Mrs. Meyer's cheerful demeanor faltered for a moment, and she glanced nervously at her husband. "It's probably just the wind," she said quickly, but there was a tremor in her voice. After that, conversations with our neighbors took on a new tone. Some were evasive, like the Myers. while others seemed genuinely clueless. But there were a few who reacted with subtle, telltale signs of fear or discomfort. One such neighbor was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly widow who lived 2 houses down. When we mentioned the chanting, her face went pale and she quickly changed the subject. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to pay her a visit alone. Emily wasn't comfortable with the idea, but we both knew we needed answers. I knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door one afternoon and she answered with a wary expression. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to talk to you about the chanting," I said, keeping my voice low. "Please, we're not safe. I need to know what you know." She hesitated, looking around nervously before stepping aside to let me in. Her house was dimly lit, filled with the scent of old books and lavender. She led me to the living room, where we sat across from each other. "I have lived here for over 40 years, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "The chanting started about 20 years ago, after that new development was built. I have seen things, heard things, but the people who speak out disappear. It is safer to stay quiet." My heart pounded in my chest. "Do you know who they are?" She nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "The cult, they are the descendants of the original settlers. They never left. They blend in, keep to themselves. But they've always been here, watching, waiting. Why hasn't anyone done anything?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. "They are powerful," she replied. "They have connections, control, and they're willing to do anything to protect their secrets." I thanked her and left, my mind racing with the implications of what she had told me. Emily and I were up against a force far more dangerous and entrenched than we had imagined, but knowing the truth only strengthened our resolve. We decided to try one last effort to gather evidence. We placed a hidden camera near the wooded area where we had seen the ritual. For several nights we watched the footage, hoping to catch something definitive. On the 4th night, we struck gold. The camera captured the cult members in the clearing, chanting and performing their ritual. It was blurry, but it was undeniable proof. Armed with this evidence, we returned to the police station. This time, we demanded to speak to a higher authority. After much persistence, we were granted an audience with Detective Harris, a stern-looking man in his 50s. We showed him the footage, and to our relief, he took it seriously. "This is disturbing," he said, frowning at the screen. "I'll start an investigation immediately." For the first time in weeks, we felt a glimmer of hope, but that night the cult retaliated. We woke to the sound of glass shattering. Someone had thrown a brick through our window with another note attached. "You were warned." The message was clear. They knew we had gone to the police, and they were not going to let us expose them without a fight. We knew we had to be more careful, but we couldn't back down now. The next day, Emily and I went to the library to continue our research. We needed to find out more about the cult's history and any weaknesses we could exploit. As we delved into old newspapers and historical records, we uncovered a pattern of disappearances and unexplained deaths dating back decades. The cult had been operating in the shadows for far longer than we had imagined. That evening, as we returned home, we noticed a car following us. Panic set in, but we managed to lose them by taking a series of random turns. When we finally made it back to our house, we realized just how close we were to real danger. The cult was watching us, and they were getting bolder. We decided to confront Mr. Henderson. He had always seemed a bit too reassuring, and now we suspected he might know more than he was letting on. Under the guise of asking for gardening advice, I struck up a conversation with him while Emily discreetly recorded it. "So, Mr. Henderson, what can you tell me about the history of this neighborhood?" I asked casually. He looked up from his rose bushes, his expression unreadable. "It's a quiet place, lots of history." "Why do you ask?" "We've been hearing some strange things," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Some old legends about the area." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Legends are just that, stories. Best not to get caught up in them." But I pressed on. "We've heard rumors about a cult. Do you know anything about that?" For a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, fear, anger, or perhaps both. Then he forced a smile. Just rumors, nothing more. You two should focus on settling in, not chasing ghosts. It was clear he wasn't going to give us any information willingly, but his reaction confirmed our suspicions. We thanked him and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night the chanting returned, louder and more menacing than ever. It seemed to echo through the walls, making sleep impossible. Emily and I sat in the living room, clutching each other, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. Suddenly there was a loud knock on the door. We froze, our hearts pounding. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I grabbed a baseball bat and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking. "It's Detective Harris," came the reply. "I need to talk to you." Relief washed over me as I opened the door. Harris stepped inside, looking grim. "We've been following up on your information," he said. "There's just something you need to see." He led us to his car and drove us to the police station. There, he showed us a file filled with photos and reports. These are from past investigations into the cult. Every time we get close, the evidence disappears. Witnesses recant their statements, and officers involved in the cases face repercussions. I looked at the photos, my stomach turning. What kind of repercussions? Threats, disappearances, even deaths, Harris replied. The cult is deeply entrenched in this community. They have people in positions of power. But now, with your evidence, we have a chance to bring them down. Emily and I exchanged a determined look. "What do we need to do?" she asked. Harris outlined a plan. We would need to gather more concrete evidence, something undeniable that couldn't be dismissed or made to disappear. He suggested we try to infiltrate one of the cult's rituals, but the risk was enormous. If we were caught, we would likely be killed. Despite the danger, we agreed. We couldn't live in fear any longer. Harris arranged for us to have a safe house to retreat to if things went wrong. With his help, we began preparing for the infiltration. We bought disguises, practiced moving silently, and studied the layout of the wooded area where the rituals took place. The night of the infiltration arrived. Emily and I donned our disguises and made our way to the clearing. We stayed hidden in the shadows, our hearts pounding as we watched the cult members gather. The chanting began, and we crept closer, careful to remain unseen. As we observed, we noticed a man who seemed to be leading the ritual. He wore a distinctive robe and carried a staff adorned with strange symbols. I recognized him as Mr. Henderson. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He was more than just a neighbor, he was one of the cult's leaders. We recorded everything, capturing the ritual in its entirety. Just as the ceremony was reaching its climax, we heard a twig snap behind us. We turned to see two cult members standing there, their eyes wide with surprise and anger. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. We bolted through the woods, the cult members in hot pursuit. The darkness was disorienting, and I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, but adrenaline kept me going. We burst out of the woods and onto a nearby street where Harris was waiting in his car. We dove in, and he sped off, leaving our pursuers behind. My chest heaved with relief as we watched the figures disappear into the distance. Back at the safe house, we reviewed the footage with Harris. It was clear and damning evidence that couldn't be ignored. He promised to take it to his superiors and ensure that the cult was exposed and dismantled. But as we sat there, a sense of unease settled over us. We had struck a blow against the cult, but we knew they wouldn't take it lying down. We would need to be vigilant, to protect ourselves and each other from whatever retaliation might come. That night, as we tried to sleep in the safe house, the chanting began again. But this time it was different. It was louder, more frenzied, as if the cult knew they were cornered and were preparing for one final, desperate act. Emily and I held each other close, knowing that the battle was far from over. The confrontation had only just begun, and we would need all our courage and determination to see it through to the end.